Germany's defense minister has announced plans to build what he calls Europe's strongest conventional army.
As stated by the Chancellor and as I myself believe, to have the strongest conventional army in Europe.
Germany's defense minister stood in front of cameras in April 2026, named Russia as Germany's primary military threat, announced plans to build the largest conventional army in Europe, and then, completely deadpan, said that releasing the classified parts of the strategy would be, quote, tantamount to adding Vladimir Putin to our email distribution list. That line got laughs, which is insane, because we are talking about Germany, the country that spent the better part of 7 decades being constitutionally, culturally, and politically allergic to having a strong military, suddenly cracking jokes at a press conference about war plans. NATO has been asking Germany to rearm for years, which is either a sign of desperate times or proof that nobody in Brussels owns a history book, because the last time Berlin decided it needed the strongest military in Europe, a certain mustachioed gentleman got involved, painted some maps, and it took the rest of the planet 5 years to fix it. An alliance that literally exists because of Germany is now begging Berlin to build more tanks. History is not subtle. On April 22, 2026, the Bundeswehr published its first standalone military strategy since the organization was founded in 1955. 71 years, not a typo. The country that sits in the geographic center of Europe, borders 9 NATO allies, and is the largest economy on the continent, went 71 years without formally writing down what its military was actually for. That document changed something, and here's the part that should genuinely unsettle Moscow. This time, they wrote it down. The document is called Verantwortung für Europa, Responsibility for Europe, which sounds exactly like something a German bureaucrat would title a war plan, and yet somehow the contents are not boring at all. The strategy names Russia as the primary threat, not regional instability, not evolving security challenges, Russia by name, and it goes further. Bundeswehr Chief Carsten Breuer has stated publicly that Russia could be capable of a large-scale attack on NATO territory as early as 2029. That's not a vague warning horizon, that's a deadline. The Bundeswehr telling its own government it has roughly 3 years to get ready for something that might actually happen. To understand how significant that is, you have to understand where Germany was coming from. After World War II, Germany's approach to military power was essentially as little as possible, please. That was national identity, not just policy. Berlin rebuilt itself as a trading nation that settled disputes through negotiation and economic leverage rather than force. The military was there to satisfy NATO membership requirements and not much else. Defense spending hovered around 1% of GDP for years while the rest of the alliance quietly fumed about it. Then February 2022 happened. Russia invaded Ukraine, and Chancellor Olaf Scholz stood up 3 days later and declared a Zeitenwende, a historical turning point. He announced a 100 billion euro special fund for the Bundeswehr. That was the headline. But announcements are easy. What actually followed was years of bureaucratic slog, procurement delays, and the embarrassing revelation that some German battalions were only 30 to 50% staffed. What happened in April 2026 is different because it's structural. This isn't a speech, it's a law. New legislation that took effect in January 2026 enshrines the military expansion milestones directly into German law. If voluntary recruitment falls short, conscription is already written in as the fallback. That's not a political promise, that's a legal obligation. Let's talk about the actual scale of what Germany is trying to do here, because some of these figures are genuinely staggering. The Bundeswehr currently has about 185,000 active duty soldiers. The new strategy targets 260,000 active troops and at least 200,000 reservists, a combined combat-ready force of 460,000. To put that in European context, that would make Germany the largest conventional military on the continent by a significant margin. Recruitment is already running 10% above last year's pace, with applications up 20%, which suggests that Russians invading neighboring countries turns out to be fairly good advertising for military careers. The plan runs in 3 phases, each timed to a specific threat horizon. The first pushes hard on readiness through 2029, directly matching Brewer's attack window. The second builds new capabilities through 2035, and the third is a technology-driven maturation phase running through 2039, with the stated end goal of becoming what their own document calls the strongest conventional fighting force in Europe. Now here's where it gets complicated. Personnel numbers are the easy part to announce. Equipment is harder. The Bundeswehr sent real hardware to Ukraine: Leopards, Panzerhaubitze 2000 howitzers, Patriot and Iris-T batteries, and the shelves it left behind are not refilling fast. One CSIS analysis found that at current procurement rates, rebuilding the tank stock to 2004 levels takes roughly 40 years. Howitzers, longer. Russia could reproduce Berlin's entire 2021 equipment inventory in 2 to 7 months, because Moscow set up a war economy in 2022 and never looked back. That's not a metaphor. That's the actual gap the Bundeswehr is trying to close. Berlin ordered 198 Leopard 2A8 tanks with deliveries beginning in April 2026. At roughly 33 per year through 2030, that's not a war-pace procurement. That's a peacetime schedule running against a 2029 threat window. The defense minister himself acknowledged at the press conference that global demand for air defense systems has compressed production capacity, and Germany doesn't control all the variables, which is a polite way of saying the factories aren't magic. Strip away the headcount targets and something more interesting is underneath. The new strategy abandons what you could call the how many tanks model of force planning. The old approach was essentially headcount driven. Here are our divisions, here are our equipment numbers, here's how many boots we can put in a field. The new approach is capability based. Germany is asking a different question. What do we need to be able to do, and what does it take to do it? The capability priorities tell you exactly where Germany thinks the next war gets decided. Long-range precision strike makes the list, significant because Berlin has historically been extremely cautious about anything that sounds like offensive capability. Hypersonic missile defense is in there too, which means someone in Berlin has been watching what Russian Kinzhals and Zircons are doing to Ukrainian infrastructure and concluded that standard air defense is no longer sufficient. Drone forces rounded out, alongside AI-integrated command networks, battlefield digitization, and a layered ground-based air defense architecture built specifically for the hypersonic threat. The one-theater approach embedded in the document is the other doctrinal shift worth paying attention to. Previous German planning treated NATO territory, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific as separate problems. The new strategy treats them as interconnected security spaces. The Federal Republic is formally acknowledging that the world doesn't neatly separate into regional boxes anymore, and that a European deterrent strategy which pretends Asia doesn't exist is already obsolete. There's one specific commitment in the document that carries more weight than anything else: Panzer Brigade 45 in Lithuania. Roughly 2,800 German soldiers permanently stationed on NATO's eastern flank, with full operational capability targeted for 2027. That's a German armored unit sitting on Russia's doorstep with orders to stay there. The first permanent combat deployment outside German territory since 1945. Let that land for a second. While all of this future planning was being announced, Berlin was also cutting large checks and shipping real hardware to a real war. The headline number for 2026 Ukraine support is 11.5 billion euros, the figure locked into Germany's federal budget. That makes Germany Ukraine's largest military backer in Europe by a wide margin. To put that in perspective, it's more than most countries spend on their entire defense budgets. The April 2026 package alone, signed during Zelensky's visit to Berlin, was worth 4 billion euros, hundreds of Patriot missiles, additional Iris-T air defense launchers financed through Deal Defense, a joint agreement to share digital battlefield data. Germany is also funding a contract between Ukraine and Raytheon directly, paying for Patriot interceptor missiles from the American manufacturer to be delivered to Ukrainian forces. That's Berlin writing checks to American arms companies to arm Kiev, which is either deeply ironic or just how wars get won in 2026, depending on your perspective. On the artillery side, a €750 million program to produce 200 Bodana self-propelled howitzers mounted on Mercedes-Benz Zetros chassis. That is a Ukrainian artillery system with a German truck underneath it, paid for by German money, being built to fight a Russian army. Germany is also funding Ukrainian domestic drone production. €200 million toward Ukrainian-manufactured UAVs, and co-production of reconnaissance drones between the German firm Quantum Systems and Ukrainian company Frontline Robotics. Then there's the Electronic Warfare Coalition. Electronic warfare is the invisible layer that determines who gets hit and who doesn't. Drones without EW coverage die fast. Command networks without it get jammed, and whoever wins that frequency battle tends to win the engagement above it. Berlin recognized this early and stood up a 10-nation partnership specifically to fix that problem for Ukraine. What's being sent to Ukraine isn't boxes of weapons, it's the industrial capacity to keep fighting. Berlin is betting on Ukraine's ability to compound these assets over time. Sustainable air defense, locally manufactured artillery, scalable drone production, rather than just consume whatever arrives in a crate. But the real shift isn't just in the budget, it's in the culture. The Bundeswehr is an institution that spent decades essentially apologizing for existing. Now officers are being told to prepare for actual combat on the eastern flank. Retention remains a nightmare because of Germany's legendary bureaucratic weight. They've literally launched a plan with 580 steps just to reduce paperwork. But when the defense minister drops the diplomatic hedging and names Russia as the primary threat, that sentence lands differently inside a barracks than it does in a newspaper. For the first time in living memory, the Bundeswehr is being asked to be a war-fighting organization, not just a placeholder. Russia has a calculus problem. In 2022, Putin's invasion of Ukraine was partly based on a bet that Western Europe would fold, economically, politically, militarily. That Germany would flinch first, because Germany was the most energy dependent on Russia, the most economically intertwined, the most politically divided, and the most historically reluctant to show military force. As bets go, it wasn't stupid, it was just wrong about Germany specifically. What has happened since is that each escalation Russia applied, energy cutoff, infrastructure strikes, nuclear signaling, produced the opposite of the intended effect. Nord Stream became irrelevant almost overnight, with the next 18 months spent building LNG terminals fast enough to make Russian gas optional instead of existential. The nuclear signaling was supposed to freeze Western resolve. Instead, it passed a €100 billion defense fund. The Ukrainians started holding the line, and German public opinion shifted. By April 2026, the Federal Republic isn't just rearming. It's doing so with an explicitly published document stating that Russia is the reason. Pistorius did not soften that. A regional actor with destabilizing tendencies is the diplomatic equivalent of calling a house fire a thermal event, and he didn't bother with any of it. He said Russia is preparing for direct military confrontation with NATO, treats military force as a legitimate policy tool, and represents a primary threat. That's a formal declaration of strategic orientation from the country that sits geographically between NATO's western weight and its eastern flank. Russia currently has the industrial momentum. It's producing weapons far faster than Europe can. That advantage is real, and the numbers don't lie. But industrial momentum doesn't hold forever against a coalition that has decided to stop treating defense as a discretionary budget item. Berlin alone has committed €83 billion in defense spending for 2026, with a longer program approaching €350 billion stretching to 2041. That kind of money, applied consistently, changes the industrial equation. Not in 1 year, but in 10. Here's the honest read. The announcement is serious, the funding is locked in law, and Brewer's 2029 threat window is a calibrated professional judgment about where Russian force recovery timelines and NATO readiness gaps intersect, not fear-mongering. The The gap between plan and execution is also real, and Berlin knows it. Pistorius said it at the press conference. We have the money and we've triggered procurement, but we don't control all the variables. Production bottlenecks are NATO-wide, Patriot interceptors are globally scarce, and a military culture that spent decades optimizing for restraint doesn't become a war-fighting institution because someone published a document. Culture changes slower than budgets. What Germany brings that most European countries can't match is the economic weight to sustain a long buildup even when it's painful. The question isn't whether Berlin can afford it, it's whether political will persist through procurement delays, contractor overruns, and the friction of turning a peacetime bureaucracy into something that can actually fight. The brigade in Lithuania is the most honest indicator, not the press conferences, the physical presence of German soldiers on NATO's eastern flank with a mandate to stay. That commitment is harder to walk back than a budget line. Walking back is exactly what Russian planning banks on. This time they wrote it into law. In 1955, the entire premise of the Bundeswehr was that German military power needed to be embedded in multilateral structures, subordinated to collective decision-making, constrained at every level. That was the lesson of what happened the last time Berlin decided unilaterally what to do with a large military. The lesson was correct. The constraint was necessary. What 2026 represents is Germany deciding the constraints themselves need to evolve, because the threat environment has changed enough that the old posture no longer works. Not because the Federal Republic wants to project power for its own sake, because the alliance it belongs to faces a genuine military threat on its eastern flank, and Berlin is the largest member state that can actually do something about it.